Hello, everybody. Just as a pre-note, I apologize in advance for my voice. I've been trying to deny the fact that I've been getting sick this whole time I've been in Amsterdam, but now it's finally catching up to me. So I'll be sipping on water, and I hope that I don't squeak too badly. My name is Ben Straub. I've worked on a lot of different things in my career. I've been in this job for about 15 years now. I've worked on device drivers. I've worked on desktop applications. I even helped write a book on Git. But the thing I want to talk about today is automation. Probably the most interesting thing that I've ever worked on in my career is building tools for my teammates, building automated things to help my team work better. And the most interesting part of that is not the REST API for the chat system that you're using, it's the human part of the system. And I like to call this cultural automation, which I think is a term I maybe made up when I was writing this talk. Now, what I mean by cultural automation is the use of computers to augment and assist with and amplify social interactions. It's a really long-winded and academic-sounding thing, and it almost sounds kind of like a useless definition, but there's a 99% chance you've already done this. Now, I'm old enough to remember when adding a phone to, or adding a camera to a phone sounded like a really dumb idea. But in hindsight, it seems obvious that we would be using these things for more than just calling and sending text messages. This is a really big deal. It's bigger than it even sounds. Right? For most of human history, we've only been able to use our bodies and our voices to communicate with each other. It's been a fairly recent development that we've added text to that mix, and it's only been in the last 10 years or so that we've added imagery into that ability, at least in a direct, immediate form of communication. This is a really powerful medium, and the reason you know that it's powerful is that you can be good at it and you can be bad at it. And I've known some people that are really, really good at this. I knew a person who took some time off of work between jobs, took several months to sort of, I think he called it fun employment. And when somebody asked him in a chat room, what have you been up to? What have you been doing for these last few months? He responded with just an image. No words, nothing else. Like, he used this image the way that a poet uses words. Very, very powerful sort of thing. And this said way more than he could have said by typing all day into a little text box. So Steve Jobs used to tell this anecdote about bicycles. And if you've heard this before, I apologize in advance for telling it poorly. If you haven't heard it, here it is. In the 70s, there was a study on the efficiency of locomotion. This is how much energy it takes different species to move a given distance. Now, on this chart, the most efficient measurements are on the bottom of the chart, and the largest things are on the right. And in the natural world, you can kind of see the salmon and horses sort of came out on top. Humans are somewhere in the middle. Now, somebody thought to include the transportation technologies of the day into this chart, and cars and airplanes sort of figured right in the middle. They're bigger, but they're about less efficient than horses and salmon. But then somebody added a person on a bicycle. And they were way ahead, like a factor of 3 more efficient than the salmon. Now, Steve used to say that the computer is like a bicycle for your mind. This is a tool that allows us to go farther, to do more than you could without it. I like to think of cultural automation as a bicycle for your voice. This is not just a thing that allows you to do more of the same thing that you're doing now. It's a tool that lets you do things that were unthinkable without it. So that's a super rosy view of automation, right? As developers and engineers, we're all trained. We all have grown up thinking that computers are great. They're all good for us. And with a few exceptions, that assumption has borne out to be true. The world is a much different, and most would say a much better place than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And a lot of that is because of automation. But we also know as engineers and developers that computers are really stupid. And I don't have to tell any of you how really pedantic they can be about what you tell them to do. What we've learned from a couple thousand years of making machines and about 50 or 60 years of writing code as a species, that we have to be careful where we point these things. So when we talk about automating culture, there's a certain amount of caution that's in order. We've got to make sure that we're paying attention to the lessons we learn from making all of these things, and that we learn from making our mistakes. Now, the best mistakes to learn from are other people's mistakes, so I'm going to tell you a few stories, and hopefully we'll all come out a little smarter at the end. The first story I want to share with you is from when I worked at GitHub. When I joined, I was completely astonished at how different this place was from other companies. I learned in university that making software is mostly a social problem. The technical aspect of it is far secondary to the social problem of getting people to work together. But GitHub took such a different take on that fundamental truth from any company that I've worked at before or since. And one of the biggest factors in this is that GitHub is a remote-first workplace. Nothing in their business model, nothing in the way that you work there assumes that you'll be in the office at any given time. On a practical level, that means that most communication happens in the chat room. And early on in the company's history, that chat room started to be automated. This is Hubot. This is a robot that connects to the chat room just like any other user. And from what I can piece together, he started out as kind of a half joke. People started using him to insert GIFs and put pictures of pugs into the chat room. But at some point, someone taught him how to unlock the front door, and it was sort of all downhill from there. The best use of this, and if you've heard of Hubot before, you've probably heard about him in the context of doing deployment. GitHub deploys software to production hundreds of times every week. And the only interface for deployment at GitHub is Hubot. You do this all from the chat room. Now, this is a little bit interesting on a technical level. There's a lot of pieces that have to be ready for this sort of thing to happen. But most of the nuance and the interestingness here is social. Now, the chat room becomes an information radiator. You can tell what your team is up to just by hanging out in chat. Just by looking at the chat room, you can tell what people are doing, what they're shipping to production right now. When a deploy goes badly, you don't have to run and go get help. You don't have to run screaming around the office. Everybody already knows. They were there when it happened. They saw it happen. They know exactly what the problem is. They know what you were trying to do, and probably someone already knows how to fix that problem. You have a lot of situational awareness from putting your stuff in a social medium like chat. Another great example is doing metrics. Now, gathering metrics and displaying graphs and digging through all the numbers is probably something we've all done at one point or another. But doing it in a chat room is fundamentally different. When you put a graph like this in the chat room, it's not the same as looking at it in a browser. What you're saying by doing this is, everybody, I found something. You should all see this. This isn't looking at a graph. This is putting a graph on the main screen in mission control. This has a benefit. Everyone can see what the most experienced engineer on the team is doing. They can see their workflow. What does this really experienced person do to find a problem? How do they discover the problem? What metrics do they pay attention to? Which graphs are they looking at? How do they share this information with other people? Hubot turns the chat room into the place where you're pairing with everyone all of the time. Now, one subtle advantage this confers is with onboarding. Not only do you see this stuff every day, not only do you see it happen 200 times a week, you see it on your first day. Now, Jesse Newland at GitHub coined the term chat ops to describe all of this sort of automation. Now, there are drawbacks to this approach as well. One of them is noise. You start putting stuff in the chat room, all of a sudden the chat room fills up. When your whole product team is 5 or 10 people, this is pretty manageable. It's actually kind of nice. When you grow to 50 or 100 people on your team, this starts to get unmanageable. It starts to get kind of painful. Maybe you split off into separate projects, and you put those projects in their own chat ops channels. Maybe you just take all of the notifications for a certain kind of thing and put it in its own channel, and now everyone ignores it. Pretty soon, your Slack starts to look like this. And now you have to figure out which one of these unread messages actually deserves your attention. Which of these is important to read, and which of them is safe to ignore. You start to lose your situational awareness because you're starting to tune out a lot of the noise. You filter it out unconsciously or deliberately. So the GitHub story is an empowerment tale, but it's also a cautionary one. It's tempting to just plow ahead blindly and add this kind of automation to your team, but you've got to really think carefully about how it's going to work with your specific team, with your specific product, with your ops infrastructure, before you just apply this. It's not something you can just spread like peanut butter on top of your existing organization. My next story is about one of my favorite punching bags when it comes to social automation. This is how, at one point in history, Facebook told you that some of your friends had birthdays. and you get a little box, so you can send them all a short message. Sounds nice. But what happens is that the box is so small, and I have so many friends with birthdays today that I just copy and paste the same message in every box. Or I get lazy and I just type HBD, enter. I even remember a time when you could just click a button and Facebook would compose a short message for you and send it off. And the affordance here is not towards more social connection, towards more meaningful connections with the people you know. It's towards less. You're encouraged to copy and paste. You're encouraged to keep your messages short and quick and easy to type, generic. Contrast this to getting an actual birthday card. Someone went to the store. They went down the aisle and they picked out what they thought was the perfect card for you. They spent actual money on it. They had to come up with something to write in it that was real and heartfelt. They had to write it out themselves by hand. They got a cramp in their hand because nobody writes things by hand anymore. They licked that disgusting envelope glue. They went out and spent more money on a stamp and actually physically went to a post box to send it to you. And they literally did this all days in advance so that it would get to you on your actual birthday. This is a case where automation hurts you. When birthday cards work, it's not because of the card. It's because you can tell how much thought and effort was put in by the person who sent it. It's because you can tell that they care about you. Letting machine do all the hard work here sucks every drop of meaning out of the whole exchange. But I do still feel bad when I only get 3 happy birthdays on Facebook, and one of them is my mom. So my third story is not mine. This is a post that made the rounds a little while ago. It's by a guy named Jason Hutchison. And his development team has a funny thing that they do. They take one of their team members' faces. This is Chris. It's not Jason. This is Chris. And they put his face on everything. They just Photoshop his face into photos. Here he is accepting a delicious plate of nachos from the President of the United States. It was a really big moment in his life. Now, Jason thought it would be possible to train a robot to do this work for him, to go ahead and do all the Photoshop magic with it. So he wrote a bot that used facial recognition to take a random Chris face and put it on top of a face that was in that photo. And the result is amazing. It's so good. Now, ChrisBot isn't perfect, but Jason did such a good job with this. There's so many good details here. Like, you can tell that the faces that were in the back in the original photo still stay in the back, so you get the right ordering. Like, the faces are drawn on top of each other in the right order. If ChrisBot doesn't find a face in the photo, he still tries to do something entertaining anyway. So you can imagine the day that this went live, that was a day of zero productivity. It was a black hole. Everybody's trying this out. They're all trying to find its weaknesses and its limitations and just having a blast with it. But not too long after that, Jason reports that there was another reaction. So ChrisBot was successful in that it removed all the drudgery from photoshopping Chris's face into photos, but it also removed the humanity of doing that. Right? This is almost a little bit like a birthday card. It takes away the taste and the cleverness of doing that, and it replaces it with sort of a sideshow entertainment. When a new Chrisified photo comes through now, you're not laughing at the joke. You're laughing at the absurdity of a computer trying to be funny. You're not laughing with ChrisBot. You're laughing at ChrisBot. And that's a very different mechanic, right? And we're not worried about ChrisBot's feelings in this case, but it's still a different kind of a joke. Now, I reached out to Jason and asked him, and he said ChrisBot is still running. It's about 3 months later. But I have a prediction about a potential downside to this. ChrisBot only knows one joke, and it's not going to be funny forever. So my guess is that use of this will tail off after a while, unless it keeps getting refreshed. This is an entertainment product, so if you don't keep it fresh and funny and new, people will get tired of it, and it will just die off. So different than letting people do this. People doing this is evergreen, right? You can always come up with a new clever joke to do manually, but letting ChrisBot do it, it's a different kind of a thing. All right, I have a few more stories to tell you, but this is a good time to stop and sort of take stock of some of the lessons that we've learned. These are a few things I noticed as I was putting this together. There's a saying in the art world that the medium is part of the message. Now, taken as a medium, automating things in a chat room adds some connotation to the thing that you're trying to automate. The first thing that it says is that we're going to be doing this thing more than once. It also says that we want this thing to be done the same way every time, or at least following a very simple pattern. We don't want any human error to sneak in at all. That's what we're trying to avoid. Another thing specifically for social automation, like chat automation, is that we want this thing to be visible. We want more than one person to see this happening at any given time. And we don't care how personal it is. This one's important when the target of your automation is a person instead of just like deploying software to computers. If you're trying to send something to a person, thoughtfulness sometimes counts. You got to be careful there. Another thing I noticed as I was putting this together is that every one of these automations has a before and after story that goes something like, well, we used to do it this way, and now we do it this way. They've all changed the human culture around them in the workflows, so like putting a stone in a river. Some of the ways that the river changes when you put a stone in it are exactly what you would think. But some of them are emergent. Some of them you cannot predict in advance. So that's actually the theme for this next part of the talk, is whether we can be more deliberate in how we change culture with these chat plugins. Can we automate something? Can we nudge culture in a specific direction? So I work for Zendesk now. And one of my coworkers there told me about this blog post from someone at 18F. 18F is an organization within the US government that is responsible for modernizing all of the web applications that the government provides to both internally and to the citizenry of the United States. And this specific idea was to sort of gently push people away from using the word guys in a crowd that includes people that are not men. So I don't know how it is here in the Netherlands, but in the US, guys is it's a male term. It's not strongly male like dudes or gentlemen, but it's still like I'm going out with the guys means you're going out with just men. And when you use that term to say, hey, you guys, in a group that includes people that are not men, those people feel left out. Now, I haven't had this conversation with anyone who's transgendered, but the women that I've talked to say it makes them feel unnoticed, or that their presence is not important, or that they're just one of the guys. None of those feels good in a conversation. And so we want to kind of nudge people away from using that. Like, pick a different term. There's plenty of them to use. So the 18F team used a pretty simple hack. Slack has built-in autoresponders that Slackbot can do. That's right there in the settings. You just configure it, and you give it a list of responses. So Slackbot would, whenever someone in a public channel would say the word guys, Slackbot comes in and immediately and publicly calls them out for it. So I like this idea, but I thought Slackbot sounded kind of snotty and passive-aggressive about it. You wouldn't like it if a human talked to you this way. So fortunately, at Zendesk, we have our own chat robot, and so we can teach him some manners. So here's what we came up with. Our Slackbot, if he hears you say guys, he'll take you aside into a private conversation, explain what the problem is with that word, and give you a couple of alternatives. This went through a couple of iterations. This is what we settled on in the end. This is what's live today. The response for this was kind of interesting. There were a couple of different themes. The first one, and the most common one, was the response I got from men who got called out in private, and who said, this doesn't apply to me. When I say that word, I mean it in a gender-neutral way, which is exactly what we wanted. That's part of the problem, because not everyone hears it that way. Now, the first couple of iterations of this, we did a public call-out like we did like Slackbot was doing. And the response I got from that was way more positive. People saw it happening, and they would message me privately and say, this is awesome. I'm so glad you did this. This has been making me uncomfortable for a while, but I didn't want to say anything because it's not that big of a deal. I didn't want to make it into a thing that's bigger than it is. But now someone else, the robot, somebody you can't get angry at, is saying this thing for me. So I really appreciate that. But the most interesting response that I got was from our office in Melbourne. Now, in Australia, it turns out that guys really is a gender-neutral term. If you put guys on a bathroom door, everyone will use it. Men, women, in between, whatever. Everyone uses that if you just put guys on it. So it truly is a transgendered term. It's very culture-dependent. So their team got together, had an honest conversation about this, decided the word guys was gender neutral, but then also, as part of that conversation, retired certain other terms from the vernacular. Now, maybe I'm being a little silly about this, but that reaction was really profound for me. I wrote a tiny piece of code, and it made people reconsider their position on something that's sort of a sensitive topic. Now, in the US these days, that's not something you do. You don't ever tell somebody that they're wrong about something like this, because they'll start calling you names, honestly. If you travel to the US, be really careful about this. But this little bit of code made people think about their behavior in a really introspective way, and some of them actually changed. And I was really touched by that. It was way beyond the design goals for this little plugin. The downside was that some people got annoyed. Then that's no small thing. You really want, when you're automating things for culture, you want people to trust the robot. You want people to trust that it's going to do things in their favor, that it's going to work for them and not against them. Now, as a result, there's a command that you can type in to make the robot shut up about the word guys for you. And that's, I mean, obviously, the Australian team used this extensively. In the end, I think I convinced most everyone that this was a good feature to have. But some of those discussions did get a little bit heated. And I really don't want to be the language police at Zendesk, so I'd be really wary of taking on anything more controversial than the word guys in terms of correcting the use of language. Here's another story. I also used to work for a company called Gridium, a little tiny company. You've probably never heard of it. And we had a chatbot there, too. We taught him a few tricks over the years, but probably the most interesting one was the high five. Now, a real-life high five is a really simple thing. It's just two people clapping. And this is everything that birthday cards aren't. It's not very personal. It takes almost zero thought. It's a momentary impulse. It's spontaneous. It's perfect, right? Automation cannot screw this up, but it can make it more awesome. Now, let me show you how, but first I've got to set up the scene. So we've got two characters in this scene. The first one is Greg. Greg is the chief mathematician at Gridium, and he wrote the statistical model that powers their energy management product. Patrick is a salesperson at Gridium, and he needs to understand how that math translates into actual value for customers that he wants to pay them money. Greg is a really great teacher, and he runs these sessions, just open educational sessions for the sales team every now and again. And he's really good at it. And Patrick wanted to thank him for doing a great job, so he types this into Slack. Now, Gort, who is the Hubot instance for Gridium, leaps into action. He does three interesting things. The first one is that he drops a GIF into the channel. And this grabs everyone's attention visually. And the second one is that he does a channel mention. This means that, much like an actual real-life high five, it makes a sound. Your phone dings. You get an email, right? Everyone knows that this is happening. It's making a sharp sound. The third thing, and the most interesting thing from a human point of view, is that he uses the company credit card to order an Amazon gift card and emails it directly to Greg. Now, obviously, I didn't just think this up on a Tuesday morning and just throw it into the chat room. This actually took some buy-in. It was one of the founder's ideas. When he approached me with it, I thought he was kind of crazy, but when he explained it in terms of, and if you're an HR nerd, you'll recognize this term, it's a peer reward system. This is an actual term of art in HR, and it is really, really effective. It turns out that the thing that developers crave most of all, above even money, is recognition from the people that they work with. If you can give people this at a workplace, they will be way happier even than if you throw a bag of money at them. It's a very powerful thing. So Patrick could have done all of this manually, and it would have taken him maybe like 5 minutes. But this took 10 seconds. Momentary impulse. It's very spontaneous. It takes almost no thought. In fact, the less thought, the better, right? And the result is, in some ways, better than a real-life high five. You don't get that sort of visceral reaction, but it's like rainbow sparks emanated from the place where their palms met, and a heavenly guitar riff descended, and then Greg reached into his pocket and found $75. It's like an awesome high five. It's the best high five you can imagine. So we did a lot of these. This became very commonplace. Here's another example. This happened about 2 weeks before the birth of David's first child, and he tried to land a dad joke, and it didn't work. So nice job trying. You gave it a shot. Nice work. I sent this one when the other founder discovered a bug in the system. You couldn't send anything but a whole dollar amount with the high five system. And so I'm pretty sure this sent $3.14, but I never did confirm that. I don't know how granular Amazon gets. So we shipped this to the whole company, and it was immediately beloved. We were like 15 people at the time. After the initial spike of activity, we settled into this steady usage pattern. It was like 3 or 4 times a week you'd see one of these fly by. The average gift card size was $24. Almost everybody got one at some point or another. So in terms of a product launch, it was a success. In terms of what we wanted to do with the culture, it was an even bigger success. And people loved this thing so much that it changed the way you interacted with the rest of your team. People were way more likely to thank people publicly for doing something nice. And so as a result, people became way more willing to go out of their way to help someone. A really, really positive feedback cycle going on. It was designed very specifically to make everyone feel good, and not just the person giving the high five and not just the person receiving the high five, but also all the people that were just watching, that were just bystanders. There's this bystander effect that if it looks cool to them and they see it happening, they'll be more willing to participate in a more active way as well. There was also some emergent behavior. We started this pattern of sharing what we would buy with the money. There was gentle social pressure to treat yourself instead of just buying more cat food. This is a really nice set of peelers. I have them myself. They're really nice. I highly encourage. I cannot recommend them enough. And then that emergent behavior led to more emergent behavior, which also got kind of interesting. It just built and built and built and kept evolving, and it's just really interesting stuff. So the biggest downside to introducing this was that some people got anxious about attaching a dollar amount to saying thank you to somebody. It's one thing to decide to publicly thank people in front of all your peers, but it's another one to try to figure out how much is this thank you really worth. If somebody just woke up at 3 o'clock on a Saturday and saved the entire company, sending a $5 gift card probably doesn't seem right. But what is the right number for that? And so a lot of people got anxious about that. Putting a price on a thank you is not an easy thing. And so it's understandable that there would be some anxiety around that. Another one is that this is an interruption. That channel mention is a very, very noisy thing. So getting interrupted more it can be a bad thing if you're in a heads-down type profession like writing software. This did tend to self-limit. People knew that channel mention was noisy, and so they would take that into account. They would choose an appropriate channel when they were giving a high five, and they would be careful with that. Because again, that bystander effect, right? Everybody had been part of this system in one role or another, and so they knew how it worked. They knew what was going to happen. In fact, that's one of the more interesting and unique things about making chat integrations is that this is something you have to pay attention to. You need to consider that the experience of someone who is not directly using the thing that you're making, but is present when it's being used. I think that probably if you're writing a mobile app, this is something where you would consider, what does it look like if somebody's using it on the train and someone else sees them use it? That's a good way to do viral growth. In this case, it's how do you encourage more people to use it because they saw someone else use it? So now comes the part of my talk where I try to get you to do something. And the thing that I'm going to try to persuade you to do is join me in automating social things. It's not hard to do. There's 3 very simple steps. The first one is to get your team some chat software. Even if you're all in the same room together, there's still tons of benefits. My favorite one is that it allows you to have the option of going remote. And again, even if you're in the same room, this is still an important thing. Because it turns out, this is from the Stack Overflow survey last year. Turns out that programmers prefer remote work to almost any other perk. And you can sort of tell that this is mostly US respondents because health benefits is number 3 on the list. But even if you take that one out, it's still number 2. right behind, was it say, vacation and days off. People want the ability to do remote work. They want it really badly. And it's not just programmers. The rates of remote work are going up in all kinds of professions, which is great. Everyone should benefit from this sort of thing, this kind of automation. It's not just for programmers. That's the key to most of these success stories, is that they made things possible for people that aren't programmers that otherwise would be only available to somebody who can write code. Now, I could go on and on about how great chat software is. You get a searchable transcript of really important discussions. You get a lot of that cross-pollination that happens in an open office while still having the ability to shut your door to quit the chat software. There's a lot of good stuff here. I'm going to go ahead and assume that you're all sold on the idea and that you're going to go out and get some chat software if you don't have it already. And we'll skip to step 2. Step 2 is to add a robot to your chat rooms. This is becoming kind of a big deal, too. Now, this is a link to a report from the Gartner Group, and the title is sort of gibberishy and meaningless, but their main prediction is that far from being toys for just nerds, bots are going to be a part of everyday life, and it's going to happen sooner than you think. So writing a bot for your company might even be a good strategic career move. Anyway, here's what you do to make one. Choose a framework. There's lots of these around. GitHub's Hubot is an open source framework that you can use. There's lots of plugins. There's a rich ecosystem of things you can just turn on and configure, and then they're just available for you. The plugin that runs high five is one of them. It's totally open source. And you don't have to turn on the credit card part of it. You can just give high fives with no gift cards. Totally, completely out of the box. Hubot is written in CoffeeScript. And I know what you're going to say, but it's an artifact of its time. And you don't have to write CoffeeScript to use it. You can write plain JavaScript, even modern JavaScript. But if you write JavaScript all day long and you want to break, there's also which is written in Python. There's Lita, that is written in Ruby. Now, both of these have been around for almost as long as Hubot has, and so they also have plugin ecosystems, though they're not as extensive as Hubot's. Hubot is the king of the hill in this respect. Now, if you really want to dig deep and get into the internals and have a lot of control over how your robot is interacting with the chat system, I'm really excited about BotKit. This allows you to use things like threading in HipChat or interactive buttons in Slack. Right? You can really get the most out of your chat platform by really getting into the deep down details here. Really good stuff. There's a lot of good stuff here. The last step is just to get started. The easiest way to start is to turn on one of the built-in skills, like doing a GIF search. This is actually more important than it sounds. You've got to start building trust. People won't trust a robot to do serious work if they don't trust it to do something silly. Right? You've got to make sure that people really make that connection, that if they ask the robot to do something, that it's going to do it, and this is how it works, and these are the expectations. You have to train them. You have to onboard them. Once people start to trust it with the dumb stuff, they'll start to trust it with the serious stuff, and this is when things get really fun. Pick something interesting but easy to start with. My usual suggestion is just grab some data from an existing source, maybe hook into your metric system, maybe figure out how long has it been since we deployed the software. Right? Ask the robot that, reports it back in the chat room. You can use that as a passive-aggressive way to say, hey, we should ship now. The bot frameworks do all of the plumbing for you. So you really only have to write the code that only you can write. I'll show you a couple examples. This is what ping looks like in Hubot. You say Hubot ping, and it says pong. So this first argument is a regular expression. If Hubot sees a direct message coming to it that matches that expression, it'll run the function that's the second argument. And again, you can see there's fat arrows here. This is not CoffeeScript. This is modern JavaScript. Here's what that looks like in This is in Python. Very, very similar. Again, in Ruby, Ruby is very, very similar. All of these they come from the same period of time. They come from the same set of ideas. They're all very similar. This is what it looks like in BotKit. So BotKit has this extra parameter that lets you customize the contexts where it will respond. So in this case, I want all the messages in a channel that are directed at. So when you say at robot do this thing, at robot ping, I want direct messages to me, like a private conversation. But I also want an indirect mention, where if you say, like, hey, @robot, ping me, then it will also match this. So not just mention at the beginning, but also mention in the middle. And you can use this to customize. Like maybe certain commands should only be available in a very specific channel. Maybe certain commands should only be available in a direct message. You can also use one of these context identifiers to specify that you want to watch ambient things. So things that aren't directed directly at the robot, but all the chatter that's happening in a room that the robot exists in, which is how we accomplished the guys plugin. None of the words guys were sent directly to the robot. It just heard them in the room. BotKit also has a bunch of other great features. Probably the best one to explain is the ability to do conversations. So you can ask a question, get an answer, ask a follow-up question, get an answer. In the other systems, that's really hard to do. BotKit lets you just string together a bunch of callback functions, call it a conversation, and then you get to keep all that context. The framework helps you keep that context instead of having to stuff it into Redis or something like that. So doing real work is not as simple as those examples, but it's still not that hard. This is the source code to the guys plugin. Now, I don't know if you can read that. Maybe it's a little small. It's about 100 lines of code. 20 of them are a list of alternatives. You can see it up at the top. This is the source code for the High Five plugin. This is about 300 lines. 70 of them are a list of GIFs. That's them right there. Not that hard. Most of the rest of this is glue code, because it's really just sticking 2 or 3 other services in the back end and just communicating and coordinating those services. It's not that hard. You can do this. I'm telling you, just go do it. And if you do, I want to hear your stories. I hope you'll tell me what you did and how it worked out. What's your before and after story? ChatOps is becoming more widespread. I've heard a lot of mentions of it here at this conference. Has anybody else ever heard of ChatOps before? Just out of curiosity. We got a few hands. Very nice. Anybody actually using it at their office? We got a couple. All right. So this is more hands than I've seen in years past at talks like this that I've given. And so this is a thing that's happening. People are using ChatOps at their work. And it's easy to get started. Really highly encourage it. So the ChatOps community is mostly, at this moment, focused on building tools for engineers. It's mostly people writing code for other people who write code. And I want to see that move towards people writing code for everybody. I think these shouldn't be just products for nerds. We need to grow out of the Apple II era of these things and move into like the Mac or the Windows era. So make something awesome, and please tell me about it. And do you have any questions? Also, please fill out the feedback form. And there's a link there to the source code for this, but you'll also get the slides as part of this. I'm going to hand them over to my helper in the back there right after this. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks. I have a lot of questions about the credit card thing, like the company credit card thing.
OK.
So it seems amazing, but also are there limits? Could you kind of elaborate? Like, can you give stuff to yourself? Can you just award yourself $1,000 because you did an excellent job? Or?
So there were all kinds of limits we had to apply to that. Number one, you could not do it in a private message. So there was no secrets. It always had to happen in a channel with other people. Number two, we had caps for how much any one person could give in a single day. How many single gifts a person could give in a single day. And also like a global limit of how much the company credit card could be charged in any single day. You couldn't high five yourself. The robot would actually respond to that by saying, that's just clapping. Trying to think what else. No, we thought of all the abuse cases first, right? Because whenever real money is involved, you got to think about how it's going to be abused. And so we did think of those up front, and I think we never actually had any abuse, right? That's the other thing, is that when you give trust of something like this to a group of mostly cool people, which most people are, then they actually live up to your standards, right? They'll be OK with it. Now, bigger organizations, it's harder because a lot of times people find ways to hide, but still. Trust is a powerful thing.
Yeah, it's very cool. Thanks.
Anybody else? No, looks like we're clear. All right. Again, hit me up on Twitter. Tell me your stories, and thanks for coming.